I'm putting for us to look at here is the one I always put up is the purpose of the law, because we had never actually completed that. But what I was telling Joe, Joe, is that in this group we have had so much discussion about this, you know, through the videos that we watch and so on. This is not much of a much of an exploration for us. So the next one I had was troubling questions about the sanctuary and prophecy. And when I say troubling questions, it's actually troubling questions about our interpretation of the sanctuary and Bible prophecy. Sanctuary and prophecy. Alright, so those are the first two. Then number 3 is actually a more current issues type of approach. And this is more in relation to the how can I put it? The current culture of brainwashing and how easy it is to fall into it. Alright? So I'm just going to call that brainwashing. Alright, those are the 3. We were going to talk about doing a study on, starting a study in one of the books of the Bible. Joel and I were discussing that. But because of the shortness of the time, what I'm going to ask is that for the next session, we choose a book to go through. Now, I understand that David is going to be doing either Hebrews or Galatians in his next webinar. So he's just finished Romans. Yes. And so I don't want to double dip on that because I think those are very good. So if you have another book in mind for us to go into more detail with, that would be great. If you want to do one of those. So we have a suggestion for Ephesians. Really good. Do we have any other suggestions?
Ephesians are John.
The book of St. John or the epistles?
Which one? St. John.
St. John. It's one of my favorite books too, you know.
Boss.
Oh.
And after John, you can do Acts 2 also.
Oh, I love me some Acts.
Acts is good too.
Acts of the Apostles.
Oh man, but I tell you something, when I'm reading Acts, I'm like, no they didn't.
Yeah.
Alright, so we'll do one of those next session. Which one of these do you want me to jump into?
Yeah, excuse me, you mean we study the whole book of Ephesians?
Yes, so what we do is we start reading and discuss. That's it. We read and discuss, and wherever we end and pick up the next point.
Yes.
Next one.
Yeah.
So that's
what we used to do in our group.
Yes.
Nice.
Just for listen study.
Yes, that's my preferred. Just read and discuss.
Unless something comes up whereby there is a topic where Gregory and I think is important,
Yeah,
or you guys ask us to speak on a topic,
That's okay, that's
then
okay.
we might.
So
do the second one.
this one here.
Yes, that's the one.
Troubling questions about Bible
But
prophecy.
you haven't asked what the other rest
We're
is.
troubling question about the sanctuary.
And Bible prophecy.
Okay.
Alright, so that's what I'm going to focus in on. Now, these are questions more than answers. And some of them are...
That was going to be my choice.
was there?
Well, it's okay. We're going with the ladies.
Yeah, so some of these questions are not that deep. Some of them you may have answers to already. And some of them are just, these are things I'm processing, right? And I want to go. So, troubling questions about the sanctuary and the Bible prophecy. So again, it's my idea of or interpretation of it that is an issue. So the first thing I want to talk about is the sanctuary. And I'm going to ask some questions that sometimes that we skirt around because we are somewhat afraid of the answer that we might end up with. The first question I want to ask is the sanctuary in heaven a literal sanctuary? Is there a literal physical sanctuary in heaven?
I don't know.
I don't think.
So
I would have said I don't think.
literal physical sanctuary in heaven.
Not sure.
I don't know.
Now, the reason I ask that question is there are a number of implications to the answer that we give. So, let me just say a couple of things before we get into my thoughts on this. David has a series of 3 videos from another video session that he did, Bible session that he did, that talks about the sanctuary. He doesn't actually answer this question definitively, but he gives a really good study of the whole issue of the purpose of the sanctuary, and yeah, it's three topics.
I listen to them, but I never fully understand the sanctuary.
Right.
this.
So,
Sometimes we have to listen over them
More than one.
yeah, and I download them and convert them to MP3s. Hear them on driving and stuff.
You just get to listen to it.
I have found that you listen to it now, and as time passes, you gain more knowledge.
Yeah.
You listen to it
We
again.
need to
Come
go.
with a
We
more
need to
clear.
listen.
It's like when you're reading Romans or Galatians.
That's correct.
So the first question is, and I'm partial to believe there's not a literal physical sanctuary in heaven. Here's why. The first thing I always want to ask myself a question is, why is that thing there? Well, for example, why is there a Sabbath? The Bible tells us why there's a Sabbath, right? In Genesis it tells you, Genesis chapter 2, in Exodus it tells you, and in Mark it tells you, and a bunch of other places, right? The sanctuary is basically a memorial to God's creation of humanity. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. That's why as long as there's humanity, there will always be a Sabbath. Now the secondary purpose of the Sabbath is for man, God to commune with man, exclusively without work or distractions. So he put it there for a meeting time for him and man, and he only put it there because of man. Sabbath was not made for angels. There was no Sabbath in heaven because the Sabbath was made at the end of the creation of earth. And they were set before them. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So we ask ourselves, why is that there? So now when I, for example, talk about the Sabbath, why do we keep the Sabbath? I don't keep the Sabbath because the fourth commandment says to keep the Sabbath. The fourth commandment is there because the Sabbath was there first. The Sabbath didn't come into existence because of the fourth commandment. The fourth commandment was needed because they had forgotten the Sabbath. So we go back into the purpose. So now let's take a look at the sanctuary. First of all, if there is a physical sanctuary in heaven, what would be the purpose?
That's something to think about.
Now, I'm looking at that now, and I'm saying the word sanctuary means holy house, basically, right? Or sanctified place, right? All right, so
You won't need that there.
would there be a need for a sanctuary if there was no sin? That there was no separation between humanity and God, would there be any need for a sanctuary?
No.
Exactly, because a sanctuary requires a priest, a high priest in particular, and a high priest is to connect, to relate man to God. If there's no separation between man and God, there's no mediator needed.
But Christ is our high priest now.
But when did Christ become our high priest?
After the sanctuary business over on earth here.
Well, the sanctuary business on earth was a prophecy of what he was doing.
Yeah.
There was a topic that I left out that I forgot. The three roles of Christ in the plan of salvation is prophet, priest, and
kings,
judge.
judge.
And all three of these required him to be human to do it. And they're done chronologically. So consecutively. He had to come as a human being to become a prophet. Angels are not called prophets. Prophets are all human. Look in the
Angels are
Bible,
messengers.
they're all, right, angels are messengers, but prophets are messengers in human form with a message from God to humans.
Yeah.
Angels are messengers in spiritual form or celestial form with a message from God to
From
humans.
God to
But
us.
both of them are messengers from God to humans, but only the humans are called prophets. So Jesus came as prophet when he was born of Mary, and until the point that he died, he was a prophet. Before that, he was not a priest.
Yes,
Jesus was not a priest before he came to earth. He was not a priest while he was on earth. Jesus only became a priest after his resurrection and went to heaven. And that's spoken of in Hebrews, I think it's chapter 6, where it says he had to offer a sacrifice or a gift. And his blood, body and blood was the gift that was offered. So, he had to be a human being to be a prophet. He had to be a human being to be a priest. That's what Hebrews says again. He has to be from among the brethren. A priest is chosen from among the brethren. His priesthood is of the order of Melchizedek. So he's a priest after the prophet, because he had to, the end of his prophecy is when he died.
Yes.
He was no longer a prophet when he died because his life as a human being, the normal cycle, ended at his death. The next cycle of eternal life, but as a representative connection between God and man, is where he took over, which is where the priest part is.
Yes.
He's only a priest temporarily.
Until he comes again.
Till he comes again.
Yes.
And then he comes as
And
judge, the one to carry out God's judgment on humanity. He's not coming to judge us. he represents the believers as a priest.
Yes, as a priest.
He judges the unbelievers as a judge.
Judge.
He speaks to everyone here. He represents the believers here.
So how the king?
And he punishes. The king is not. There is a thing about the kingship. King was never part of God's plan in the economy of the Jews.
Yes.
It was prophet, then Christ.
Yes.
So what he did was, if you look at how he set up the sanctuary, you had the prophet Moses, and then you had the priests in the system. There was that was it.
Yes.
And then you had a legal system that was built into the sanctuary message. I was talking at lunch and I said, if you notice, in the Jewish economy, most of what God told the people is actual scientifically good information for the context that they were in. But in order for them to accept it and really take it seriously, it had to be given in a spiritual or a religious context. That's why the chief medical officer who tell people whether they were sick or not were the priests.
So are you saying that the delineation of king is something that was reserved for the Father? It was not for humanity. It was going to be his role within the entire plan of salvation and the system.
I'm saying that the role of king was not part of the plan of salvation, period.
No.
It was an overarching context in which God ruled the universe. Kingship is not a part of the plan of salvation.
Yes.
It's only a context in which salvation operates. He would have been king before, during, and after the plan of salvation activity.
So you're just talking about in terms of the plan of salvation?
Just in terms of the plan of salvation,
Yes.
which is what the sanctuary is about. It's about the plan of salvation.
Okay.
There was supposed to be a king
No,
over
there
God's
wasn't
people.
supposed to be.
Exactly.
But the people asked for it.
Bingo! And God said they
Yes.
rejected me as
Yes,
king.
king.
They asked that of a prophet
Yes.
who grew up in the high priest's house.
Yes.
And guess what happened after they went into captivity?
We know that
They-
part, you know. It's just the part where they always say, I don't know if it's in the Bible, Christ will be coming as King
King of Kings and Lord of Lords. In
Just that the part
Revelation,
I just
it
said
says
the part
that.
we're talking about.
Yes, but that King of Kings and Lord of Lords is important.
Yes.
Because before he came to earth, right, he was in the authority, sitting on the throne of the Father.
Yes.
And then after the plan of salvation is complete, where's he going to be? Same place again. Where would he have been otherwise? Same place
Same
there.
place, yeah.
He didn't need to be king to save us. He
That
does,
is true.
right? What has happened different is he has made us kings by passing on his divine life to us and make us heirs
Yes.
of what he had before. So we became kings because of him sharing his life with us. But he didn't become king because of salvation. He was king because of his inheritance of the Father.
And after he come back
Yes.
again and take home his people, remember he's gonna lay down everything to the
Father,
the
but
Father
then the
again.
Father will make him ruler over all.
Overall.
1 Corinthians 15, verse 45 to 47.
45 to 47. So,
No, sorry, 24 to 28. Sorry.
yes, 45 to 47 is about the
It's about-
death, where's your sting.
Yeah.
All right, so understand here. Prophet, priest, judge. That's the plan of salvation. Jesus Christ does all of these roles, and he has to be human to do it.
Yes.
He has to be able to judge us based on his own experience. He has to be from among the brethren to be priest, and he had to be a human being to be considered a prophet, because angels aren't called prophets. Are you with me so far?
Yeah.
Now, so when I look at that then is, would Jesus ever be a prophet if there was no sin?
No.
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 Would he ever be a priest if there was no sin?
No.
Would he ever be a judge? Would there be no sin?
No.
Would there be a sanctuary for there to be a priest if there's no priest to put in the sanctuary?
No.
No.
So then why would we have a sanctuary if there was no sin?
Because there is sin.
Alright. That gets the next question. Would there be a sanctuary in heaven before there was sin? Because there was a time when there was no sin.
Well, if sin started from in heaven with Lucifer, would there be a
Yes.
necessity for a sanctuary?
The sanctuary message, is it a plan of salvation for angels or for humanity?
Humanity.
So then it's the issue of sin is not angelic sin, it's human sin. So when sin entered earth is when it's an issue for us, not when it entered heaven. Because the angels have no plan of salvation because they started out perfect in the
Yes,
presence
and
of
they
God.
didn't fall.
And they turned away from the perfect union. Remember what Paul said? After you've been exposed to the life of Christ and then turn away, there remains no sacrifice. He was saying that in the context of what happens with angels. He was talking about what happens to the angels while they have no sacrifice for them. Because they started out perfect in the presence of God, and in being exposed to the presence of God, turned away from what they knew perfectly. We start out imperfectly, and then are brought into the relationship. They started out perfectly and willingly rebelled against it. Not just like Adam and Eve disobeyed. Fight against the one on the side of the one that was leading a rebellion against God. Alright, so the next question then that follows from that, as I asked before, is, was there a sanctuary in heaven before there was sin? If there's no sin, there's no sanctuary, because there's no priest to minister between humanity and God, because there's no humanity.
Yeah.
And then when there was humanity, until they sinned, there was no sin for a sanctuary to be needed. Cool. So why would we have a literal sanctuary in heaven?
So why the Bible mention about it?
Well, the Bible mentions the sanctuary in more than one ways, and we always keep misreading it because we misread context. First context. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them after the pattern that I show. So the first thing we did was, and Stephen Haskell did this in his book, he said a pattern is of something that already is. That is not true. Talk to any architect when he's going to build a building, he does a pattern before he builds a building. Any seamstress who's going to do a dress, what does she do first?
Makes a pattern.
She makes a pattern.
Yeah.
Is the pattern based on the dress,
well,
or did someone come up with the pattern in their head, put it down, and then they make the dress?
That is correct.
So there are times that you can pattern something off something that's pre-existing, but if it's a new invention, you create the pattern before the thing is created.
That's correct.
I understand.
So the question is, with what do we have here in this situation? Whether it is a new thing, or it is something that is coming from
That's right.
before.
And the sanctuary and earth in the Old Testament was a new thing.
And we understand that based on what you just said about prophet, priest, and judge.
That's right.
In relation to how the sanctuary and the sanctuary message works.
And the sanctuary message is the first prophetic message of salvation. Well, the first detailed prophetic message of salvation. And the rest were short, soundbite messages. The message to Adam in the garden, then the longer message to Abraham, and then details to Moses. That's why Paul keeps talking about from Moses to the prophets. Jesus explained on the road to Emmaus from Moses and the prophets, right? Because the sanctuary message is the gospel in type.
So,
in symbols.
So, understanding what you have just said, how would, and if I am getting ahead of you in terms of what you're presenting, feel free to wait until you get there. Why is it the Bible in Revelation uses sanctuary, Old Testament language so much in relationship to what Christ is now doing within the sanctuary of heaven? It's all over.
Good question. So let me respond to this first of all. What's the difference between the timeline of the Old Testament and the timeline of the New Testament? It's a tough question, right? Alright, the Old Testament timeline is 2,000 years. Basically, actually, when you look at the stories covered, it's 4,000 years. Yeah. From creation till Jesus is approximately 4,000 years. The New Testament events literally occur in a 100-year period, if so long. From the birth of Christ to the end of the writing of the book of John is less than 100 years.
Yeah.
You know what that means? In terms of context of what is given, the New Testament people were still thinking in Old Testament terms. So the language they used would be the context in which they grew up. If you went back to the 1950s, you would not be talking about an iPad.
Yeah, it's true.
If you went back to the 1850s, you would not be talking about a television.
But can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why is it as he's in vision on the Lord's day, he's seeing a temple in heaven, and he's able to describe this temple with the 12 gates in which he describes it. He's able to describe the Lord and angels with an altar of incense and everything that we see. Isn't this something that he's seeing and now putting down based on his experiences and his understanding?
Yes.
He's still visually seeing.
So he's not making that stuff up.
That's
he's
right.
Writing
That's
down
my
what he's
question.
told.
So why is the visuals in terms of how the Lord is showing in these truths that are not literal in its presentation? Why is symbolic sanctuary Old Testament language being used in these visions?
Well, if you're trying to deliver a message and you send the first message, the final message should clarify the first message to make everything clear, right? And you refer to the first message to clarify with the last.
Very good answer.
So if God starts out by telling us the gospel in a sanctuary, he's going to clear up the meaning of those symbols in the sanctuary when he's finishing up the gospel message.
Understood.
See?
So
yeah.
What you're saying then is that if God has put in place a way to deal with this issue of sin that is wrapped up in a sanctuary, an understanding of how a prophet, priest, and judge works in relation to this sanctuary, as he's ending the message symbolically, he's going to do it through the same symbols
and clarify the meanings of those.
So is that
Agreed.
there's a type, antitype?
Yes, the antitype doesn't totally clarify the type unless you get explanation with it. So that's why the Jews were missing a lot of understanding of a lot of things, because they were given the type in the Old Testament. When the antitype became clear, they couldn't see it. And that's why Jesus had to explain to the people on the road to Emmaus and to explain to Paul and the letters that were written and so on, what is meant, but what is the actual antitype of what they've been using in the type. If someone doesn't explain it to you, you probably won't see what it's really saying. It's kind of like when we talk about prophecy and say 2300 days, and somebody has to clarify, hey, 2300 days is actually 2300 years, and this is how we know. Someone has to clarify. So when you're given the sanctuary message, we have to remember the sanctuary is a type designed to teach people who were limited in understanding of celestial things. The sanctuary was literally written for slaves. Slaves who couldn't read, probably. Slaves who came out of a system where type and was all over the place. These symbols, you remember, they came out of Egyptian background. And when Moses went to the mountain, the first thing they asked for was a representative for God.
Yes.
They wanted something tangible to worship.
Say, give us
make us a God. Make us a God.
Make us a God. That
You
we
see what I'm saying?
can worship Him.
Yeah, we might go to worship Him.
Yes.
And they literally bowed down to the type. They were so trained.
Yes, that's how they worship. They bow down before the image. Yes.
That's right. Because that's what they were taught. They grew up, they were born and grew up in a pagan environment where that was the norm.
See?
So when God was teaching the actual sanctuary, the actual gospel, He had to give them types and detailed instruction as to how to even worship. They could not bow down to the priest, and they couldn't bow down to the sacrifice. They lay hands on the sacrifice and cut the throat and sprinkle the blood and all of that stuff, because it had to represent something. And then the detailed representation was explained in the New Testament. And then the more clear understanding of what was going on in the future from the time it was written, from the time of John to the future, was explained in Revelation. But they all were wrapped up in the type of the sanctuary. Alright? So, to quickly go back to the sanctuary thing now, if there would not be a need for a physical sanctuary in heaven before sin, and therefore there won't be a need for a physical sanctuary in heaven after sin. So we'll be going to heaven and seeing a high priest in heaven doing nothing for eternity. God don't waste time like that. Why would He? So that's my first strong reason why there's no literal sanctuary in heaven. Second reason I don't believe there's a literal sanctuary in heaven. Is the sanctuary in heaven a tent or a building?
We don't know. We don't know.
If there was a literal sanctuary in heaven, we have to answer that question, because both are used as references to the sanctuary message in the sanctuary. But the deal is, in the Old Testament, it was a tent until it was built as a building.
Yeah.
So it was called a tabernacle because they were actually in a tent.
Yeah.
Then it was called the temple because they were actually in a building. The reference to the heavenly sanctuary in those terms was always based on what was on earth at the time, or in the mind of the people in the discussion. If you were talking about the tabernacle made without hands, he was talking about when God introduced it for the first time in the Old Testament with Moses. And then he makes a reference to this heavenly sanctuary. And it says, your body is a temple of God. He's making a reference to the one built by Solomon and then rebuilt, because that was a structure that was a sanctuary at that time. Yes.
I was listening to the sanctuary message once, and they say Jesus went back to heaven and literally sprinkled blood.
Yeah, and that would not make sense. Whose blood will he sprinkle, and where will he be sprinkling that blood?
Adventist.
Adventist.
Adventist said that?
Yes, because he went that and literally sprinkled blood.
So I never used.
Yeah.
See, but there are people who do that.
Who says what?
Assembly Adventist speakers and when the sanctuary said that Jesus went back to heaven and literally sprinkled blood.
Are you serious?
Yeah, and the problem with that is,
I've never heard
yeah,
that.
but some people go off the deep end with the, because if you take a literal sanctuary message, there's the next part that Brother Boston references here. Which part of the earthly sanctuary is a literal representation and which one is figurative? For example, the altar of burnt sacrifice represents the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, because the sacrifices basically all represent Jesus. There is no altar of burnt sacrifice inside the tent. The only place a sacrifice occurred was outside. How did Jesus die? Was he burnt up? He was crucified. There was no fire involved in his death. So that means the altar of burnt sacrifice had to be figurative. The laver it was the next thing that they got to before they went to the sanctuary. Let me just talk with representation here.
Yeah,
so this is the outer court, this is the gate, this is the altar of burnt sacrifice, that's the laver, that's the tent, the tabernacle. Alright? Go through, you offer you lay your hands on the sacrifice, and then you, the one who's offering the sacrifice, cut the neck. The priest then burns the animal, alright, takes the blood, and on the way he stops and washes his foot with the laver.
After you cut the throat, you know, have to catch the blood.
Right, the priest catches the blood. You cut the throat, the priest catches the blood. The priest burns the animal on here and partakes of part of the animal. You go about your business after you kill the animal. The priest takes the blood and washes his feet and then sprinkles it inside.
Records it in the sanctuary.
Right? Exactly. Now it's the blood of the animal that is being sprinkled, not your blood. Because when your life goes before God, it has to be covered in Jesus.
Yes.
Depending on the sin, the blood is put on the horn of the altar sacrifice, and it also is a record flashed before the screen between the holy and the most holy. As a record, yeah.
There was also another object in here with also horns, and there was also blood sprinkled on that. That's on the Day of Atonement by the high priest only.
Yeah.
And then in here you have the altar of burnt incense, the table of shewbread, and the candlesticks.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Now, this is clearly figurative, because Jesus wasn't burnt up on the cross. This is clearly figurative, because I don't see any literal object in between heaven and earth where anybody wash anything before they go to heaven.
Some might say it's baptism.
It could be a bunch of different things, because it's the priests that wash.
That's true.
And here's why baptism would make sense.
That's true.
When you become a child of God, you become priests with Christ.
Oh yeah, we are all priests.
The priests represent human agents acting on earth, not angels. Angels are never referred to as priests, because priests have to come from among the brethren.
So when they say that when you go down under, baptize and go down and under the water and come up. That means to say your sin as washed. Your sin
is being washed. It's a symbolic representation. But the baptism Joel is referring to is the baptism of the Spirit. It's not the baptism of the symbol. Because now the symbol represents the literal, and the literal is being baptized by the Spirit in terms of covered by the blood, sin washed away, legally right to go before God. So it's like justification. Are you with me? So the baptism is the literal water baptism is another symbolic representation of that. So now this is clearly symbolic, this is clearly symbolic. So if there's a literal sanctuary in heaven, where does the literal begin and the symbolic end? Is there a literal table of shewbread that the priests have to go eat from? Who are the priests in heaven?
No. None of those things.
Would the priests be angels? Why would they qualify as priests if they were never human?
Well, the
and they're not
call
represent.
them priests, they call them messengers.
Right, they're called ministering spirits. The priests had to have come from among the brethren. So you can't have the holy place in the heavenly sanctuary because the priests are stuck on earth. You get what I'm saying?
So what is the cleansing of the sanctuary?
The cleansing of the sanctuary occurs on the Day of Atonement with the high priest. That's a special event.
When he went into the most holy place.
Into the most holy place.
Could you repeat that point about the priest being unhurt?
All right.
That you're trying to make?
The angels are not the priests. The angels, the priests have to be human agents. Because Hebrews says the priest has to be taken from among the brethren. And the priest is a representative of humanity to God. as a prophet is a representative of God to humanity. One comes from God to humans, and one comes from humans to God. When we intercede, we're doing the role of priests. We're not doing the high priest role, that's only one person. But we are actually being priests when we intercede for other people. So, the priests go inside here, but they never go in here. Now, if this is up in heaven, where are the priests? Are they angels? Are they people from other planets? How are they representing us if they don't didn't come from among us? If the holy place is in heaven, then the holy place has to be totally empty except for Jesus every now and then passing through.
Especially if you have an understanding that when you die, there is no consciousness in the state that we are in as the spirit returns to the Lord.
You never, as a human being, you never go to heaven incomplete. You always go to heaven with your full being, body and spirit.
Yeah.
Moses had to go with his body. Jesus had to go with a human body to heaven. He had to be resurrected and brought to heaven.
Yes.
Everyone who ends up in heaven goes as they were in. They
Elijah,
became.
Enoch.
Enoch. Everybody
All
who
of
went to
them.
heaven has to
All
go with a
of them.
physical body, with their spirit, not their spirit and their body left behind. So, if there's a literal sanctuary in heaven, this is a problem.
It's a different kind of body, right? Celestial and celestial.
Yeah, but your celestial body is not going to be totally different from your physical body in terms of we're going to recognize Joel when he goes to heaven.
Yeah, we're going to
We're going to recognize
It's going to be a
you,
glorified
but your
body.
body is going to be glorified, not
Yes, the
sin.
body cannot taste that. The body cannot taste that.
Decay.
exactly, incorruptible.
It
Yeah,
can be corruptible.
but you will still be flesh and blood,
Yeah, but incorruptible.
incorruptible. So that's why those bodies, when they go up, they change. So the person still looks like the person, but their body structure is matched toward the heavenly being. So then, if there's a literal sanctuary in heaven, we have a problem with the holy place. Now we could probably simply say we don't have a problem with the most holy place, because the most holy place would be in heaven, fine, because only Jesus can go in there. But then, if this is figurative and this is figurative and this has to be figurative, why can't this be figurative? The sanctuary in this part here, there's the mercy seat. What does it represent?
Throne of God.
The throne of God. What's in the box in the mercy seat?
There's a couple of things there.
The Ten Commandments and the
Moses'
testimony.
rod that bud, the Ten
The
Commandments.
bud was on the side,
Yeah.
and the manna, right, on the
Yeah,
side.
pot of manna. Isn't Moses' rod was not inside?
Aaron.
Aaron's
rod
rod,
was on the
sorry.
side, I believe. I think the
And
manna
the
was.
Ten
I
Commandments.
think only the Ten Commandments was in there, but I'm not sure. I might be wrong there. But in any case, those were all symbolic things. All right. In the heavenly sanctuary, the mercy seat is God's throne. Angels, they're not statues of angels here. They are literal angels there.
Yes,
And in the sanctuary is the law, which is a representation of the character of God. To the Old Testament Hebrews, the law represented God's character. In the New Testament, the law is the type, and the antitype is grace through faith. Based on the principle of God's kingdom, which is God is a God of love. God's law is the law of love. And this all the law and testimony. God doesn't have an actual 10 commandments in his throne. His throne is built on his character.
Well, that can be seen from the very first thing you said, the point you made about the sanctuary, the Sabbath. If there wasn't a Sabbath before there was a creation, because the Sabbath is a memorial of creation, then there was not a 10 commandment to be in his throne before there was a creation.
That's right. And his throne was clearly before earth was created. Alright, so that said, the sanctuary then is not a literal thing in heaven. It represents a literal thing that God is doing on earth and in heaven. The sanctuary starts where the sanctuary prophecy starts to be fulfilled, where Christ's death occurred. When Christ dies, altar of burnt offering, and the whole sanctuary service starts over. Now, let me just wrap up the sanctuary part here by pointing out 7 Sabbaths in the sanctuary system, in the Jewish system. The first 2 were Passover. Passover occurred over an 8-day period, from one Sabbath to the next. So those were the 2 first Sabbaths in the sanctuary system. Sabbath and Sabbath. The Passover represented Christ conquering sin forever. That's why it was a 7-day period, because 7 days represented an eternal time period. Alright? Then the last 2 were the Feast of Tabernacles. Also spanned over a 7-day period. Well, the Bible says 8 days, but it's because they go from sunset to sunset. So there's sunset on the first day, which is actually the beginning of the second day, so to speak. It's kind of a weird count. But they go sunset to sunset, and then 7 days later, sunset to sunset again. So the first 2 Sabbaths and the last 2 Sabbaths are all a 7-day gap. Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover is actually one long period. If you look at it in Leviticus chapter 23, it outlines it. The first 2 Sabbaths are Passover, the last 2 are Tabernacle. What are the other 3? The other 3 are trumpets, and then 10 days after trumpets, atonement, and then, no, my bad, scratch that. Those were the second to last. 50 days after
Pentecost.
harvest is Pentecost. That's what Pentecost means, 50 days. And then
First
trumpets, and then atonement. And then after atonement, when the sanctuary is cleansed, then tabernacles, when God dwells with his people. The beginning of the plan of salvation, the beginning of the remedy from sin. Christ first has to give us legal right to heaven. That's what the Passover does. He frees us from the legal constraints of sin and from the natural constraints of sin. Here, he gives us his spirit. Legal constraints removed, because he's made us to have right. He has reconciled us to God. He's given us right to God. Yes, our sins are forgiven. When we accept his spirit, we now have its life. Pentecost. Point of the Holy Spirit. Trumpets, warning about judgment. The judgment of earth, or it's actually the judgment of Satan, the judgment of Christ. Which system works better? Does Christ's system of his spirit in flesh, or does Satan's system of being right by works, or doing good by yourself, or finding your own way, whichever you want to call it, which one works? And then once that judgment is settled, the righteous go to heaven, then come back. No, the first fruits are here. Jesus Christ is the first fruits. And then when we get resurrected,
which one of your feasts is missing in that diagram?
There's no feast missing.
Well, you've got, start with
2.
Unleavened bread,
Passover,
Pentecost, trumpets, atonement. Something happens between atonement and tabernacles. Number 6 that you're missing.
I would like you to point that out. It's in Leviticus 23.
7 of them, you know, and you have only 6 there.
No, I have 7.
Where's
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
What you're calling 6, 7? Because tabernacle.
Tabernacle is 7. Sabbath and Sabbath. Actually, let's read that. Can somebody let me have Bible? Leviticus chapter.
First.
Leviticus chapter 23.
It's missing.
Leviticus chapter 23.
I will read them over.
Yeah, I'm having a little bit of...
Alright, so the feasts are listed out in chapter 4, in verse 4. It says in verse 5, in the 14th day of the first month, even on the Lord's at evening is the Lord's Passover, and on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread. That means sunset on the 14th, all day, right, on the 15th. So the end of the 14th day, which is the beginning of the 15th day, all day the 15th day. And then later on down, in the first day ye shall ye shall have an holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein, but ye shall offer meat to God unto fire by for 7 days. In the 7th day is a holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work. So the 2 holy convocations are on the 1st and the 7th, the 7th-day window, right? So that's the first 2 Sabbaths. Then he goes on to say in verse 9, the next one is they're going to reap the harvest. I'm just skimming through here. And then it says, on the morrow after the Sabbath, he'll wave it. So they have a wave field. That was not a holy convocation. That was just a special ceremony that occurred on the day after the Sabbath, after the first harvest. So the harvest was Thursday, the Sabbath, and then the day right after that, they have the wave sheaf. And then 7 Sabbaths later, the Sunday after that is the 50th day. That's the day of Feast of Pentecost. Alright, so you have 7 Sabbaths after the wave sheaf, and then the following Sunday is the Feast of Pentecost. So it says, where is it? Yeah, so I'm skipping through that because of time, but it's right there, and the first fruits, and it calls it a holy convocation. Then he goes on to that, and then he says, verse 21, and you shall proclaim on the selfsame day that it was maybe a holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work in all your dwellings throughout your generation. So that's a holy convocation. Then he goes on to verse 24. Speak to the children of Israel in the 7th month, in the first day of the month shall be a Sabbath, a memorial of the blowing of the trumpets. That's this one. So that's 7 months down. This whole thing occurs in 7 months. Alright, from the first month, which was Passover, was in the first month, because they were told to rename the calendar to start on the Passover month. And then the 7th month was on the 7th month, on the first day, trumpets. And on the 10th day, atonement. Both of those were holy convocations. In other words, they were holy days. So we had 2 holy convocations, 1 holy convocation here, Pentecost, 1 holy convocation, trumpets, 1 holy convocation, the Feast of Atonement, right? Day of Atonement, sorry, not feast.
So there were Sabbath days regarding whatever day of the week they fell on. It was always a Sabbath day.
That's a Sabbath day.
Holy convocation.
It's a holy convocation. That's really what a Sabbath is. A holy day of convocation, so to speak. Then he goes on and then says, on the first day shall, after that, right? He goes on to verse 34. Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of the 7th month. The 15th day of the 7th month. When was the Day of Atonement again? 10th day. And the Feast of Atonement, the Feast of Trumpets was day 1. So it's a rapid conclusion. Day 1, trumpets. Day 10, Day of Atonement. 15th day, first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. On the 15th day of the 7th month shall the Feast of Tabernacles, for 7 days unto the Lord. On the first day shall be a holy convocation, ye shall do no servile work. 7 days you shall offer a sacrifice, and so on and so forth. It's a solemn assembly, right? And let me see here. And on the 8th day is also a holy convocation. So the 7th and the 8th, right? Is a bookend again. So there were 2 Sabbaths here, 2 Sabbaths at the beginning to mark the eternal sacrifice. That means it has an eternal impact. There's no other sacrifice for sin. And the eternal tabernacle, God will dwell with us forever. In between we have these 3. Pouring out of the Spirit, calling attention to the need to come to Christ, judgment of Christ's system versus Satan's system, reward of the righteous in between, God dwelling with the righteous here. The priest stops here. The judge occurs in the 1,000 years here and in the execution, and then they dwelling together with him there. Are you with me, folks?
So you're saying right after the Day of Atonement, the priest stops?
The Day of Atonement, the system starts over, a reset. Not the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles.
No. When you said the priest stopped here, and you pointed to...
Christ as priest, I mean.
Okay, thank you.
Christ's role as high priest ends at the Day of Atonement.
Correct.
Now he's going to be judged. And the judgment occurs between end of Day of Atonement and beginning of Day of Tabernacles. Because Tabernacles is God dwelling with his people. When will God dwell with his people? When he returns with the New Jerusalem, and God makes his abode, and there's a new heaven and a new earth. Between that time is the destruction of all the wicked and the rebellious and those who have rejected the righteousness of Christ. Now question is, if there's a Feast of Tabernacles, where is that going to occur?
In heaven?
On earth.
Feast of Tabernacles on earth?
Because God is going to dwell with his people on earth. Remember, the New Jerusalem comes and sets up.
Yeah, but doesn't God's people rise and go and spend...
Bingo! Yeah. 1,000 years. But the judgment would not have occurred at that time.
Correct.
Because the Tabernacles occurs after the judgment.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
So that's why I said the judgment of Christ, the duties of Christ occurs between end of Day of Atonement and beginning of Day of Feast of Tabernacles. Because that's when he has to wipe out all of the gunk.
So what would you say the 1,000 years in heaven is represented by?
Oh, I don't think it's represented in the sanctuary
It's not-
service.
it's not
We
represented.
only have the 1,000-year reference from Revelation, not from anywhere else. The 1,000-year millennium was introduced in Revelation. It wasn't spoken of before. The only place you might say it was kind of referenced is in Peter, where Peter said, a day in the sight of the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. There's a possibility he's referring to that understanding that there's a 1,000-year rest period after the toil of sin.
Okay.
And then the system resets. And this is an eternal condition now after the reset has occurred.
So feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a long time since I looked at this. But my understanding, as best as I can remember, is that tabernacles happens in heaven because it's not our permanent home. Just as the Jews were tabernacling, they would come out of their homes and they would go into these tabernacles that they would build with tree branches that represented them being in a state and place before they get into their permanent homes. So I always thought it is that tabernacles is that 1,000-year period, because where we're really going to live is back on the earth made new.
Here's the problem with
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's
Let them make me a sanctuary that I may what? Dwell among them. Tabernacle is about God dwelling with his people forever. The tabernacle is not where God's people are. The tabernacle is where God is with his people.
Okay, and you see that as a permanent
7 days.
place, and that's why you put it here on earth.
Yeah, well, the reason I put it here on earth is because the
It happens after
destruction
the judgment. I see what you're saying.
and in reality, when we think about what happens after the destruction of the earth, it's basically open season, basically. Because we're free completely to travel and do whatever we want, because we'll be totally righteous.
Yeah.
So the Feast of Tabernacles is like, and that's all, folks, we're free. This is the beginning of our freedom from sin, and this is the result of the whole process. In between, we have to demonstrate the system of God, introduce God's people, which is those who are living with Christ, living in them. Show the bring that attention to everybody. Come to Christ before it's too late. Show the contrast between Christ's system and Satan's system. And then when Christ has been justified and venerated and proven his system to be the right, reward by us now reconciled to God. Now, which of these would be literal? Was the day of Pentecost a figurative thing? In the sanctuary it was a figurative. The literal outpouring of the Holy Spirit was a literal thing, right?
Yes.
This would be a symbolic thing of some loud cry going out to warn people. Yeah?
Yeah.
And this would be, Jesus is not in heaven killing a cow and sprinkling blood on an altar. There is no killing of animals going on in heaven.
No.
So this cannot be a literal thing going on in heaven. And this is the day that he went into the most holy place, which means this ain't literally happening in heaven.
Agreed.
So how can there be a literal sanctuary in heaven? Now what I'm saying here, if I ever see this in an Adventist church, I will never be brought back. Because this is even going against what Ellen White says. But we don't build our doctrine off a person. We build our doctrine off of God's Spirit and his word.
Well, if she was any truth of a prophet, she made a statement that there are things that we're going to have to unlearn. And some
There you
new
go.
things we're going to have to learn.
Things we will not understand until the
Yeah.
day of Christ return.
What is the
So
great
I don't
conversation?
think what you're showing us there,
What's
if
the
it
great
differs from what she has to say, would mean that you're going in the wrong direction and we need to throw her out, because she did say that there's things that we don't understand that we're going to have to get rid of.
I understand that. But this was said, she brought this up in the first 50 years and she said that was a foundational principle.
Yes, she did.
So my deal is this. We sometimes, you remember when someone spoken
Good
about
point,
a brother
Gregory.
who, his wife was, God gave him a message and he misread the message and reported differently to the church. God says she's going to be all right, and he says she's going to be healed. Then she died the following week. And then he came back and clarified and said, God told me she would be all right. I interpreted that wrongly, saying she would be healed, but that's not what he meant. What I'm sharing here is not new theology. This is directly from the Bible, which was completed and compiled almost 2,000 years before Ellen White came on the scene.
See, but what's explained to us, and that's why it's important that, like you're saying, to learn. Because growing up in the church, you hear about the time that, you know, you're being prepared for the heaven, and where there's going to be a literal sanctuary.
Yeah.
And that is why we are going through this experience now, so we get there. So it's important to understand what that means in terms of what we're going through now. To see that certain things can be literal.
Yeah, the striking statement that you're making, though, is when you make the point that you're right. She did say that there are men who are going to come, who are going to try and change two things about our understanding. One of them we are in agreement with.
Yes.
Because she spoke about the nature of God. And you're right. But another thing that she called a fundamental principle is the sanctuary. And that there are going to be men who came and tried to change our understanding of the sanctuary. So we're both we're doing one of the things that she would be in agreement with. But on the other hand, there's a difference in our opinion.
That's right.
On where she stood in regards to the sanctuary.
My response to that when I thought it, because I'm one of those people who don't believe I'm so smart that I can, people who spend hours and hours in prayer and study, come up with something and then I look at it and say that don't make sense, and suddenly my word is more important than yours. Well, here's one of the things I've learned. I studied logic because I'm a math person. The more I study the Bible, the more God makes sense.
Yes.
Amen.
When God makes sense, I don't need figurative things to make it make sense to me. The figures make more sense. In other words, I heard somebody say God has common sense. God's system is a natural-based system, not a legal-based system. The legal-based system is a fill-in till the natural thing comes to pass. Now, in that case, why would he stick a legal implement for us to keep remembering over and over when the natural solution has come and the thing has been fixed? Here's what I mean. I told somebody, when Jesus Christ comes back, we're not going to have any Bibles in heaven, not in heaven, in the new earth. No Bibles in the new earth, because all things are passed away and the remembrance of it is gone. The Bible has a bunch of bad stuff happening that we probably won't want to remember in heaven. But when we have the living word with us, why would we need the living word?
Amen.
So we have to remember those things. It's getting dark, and we have stayed quite a long time. Yes, amen to that. And now we're going to get a free car wash. But I thank you very much for your time and your patience and your participation. This is just one part of the question. I have some other things about prophecy, but it's the troubling questions about the sanctuary, I said. Alright, that's all for today. Any last comments before we close off? Alright, let's close off with a word of prayer. Let me ask Sister Shanda to close us off, please.
Okay, let us pray. Kind Heavenly Father, we are so thankful, Lord, for the time that we have spent here today. It's a sweet, sweet thing to come together and to spend time in your word and spend time studying about your word. So thankful for what you continue to do with us through this new message and what you continue to do with us, Lord, in our understanding. Help us that as we learn that we will spread this gospel, which is truly a delight. This is good news. So as we leave from here, we ask that you will go with us and keep us all safe, take us to our safe destinations, keep us from the coming week, Lord. Give us strength, give us your peace, give us your guidance as we go through it. Help us to keep each other uplifted, continue in faith, Lord, knowing that we continue to trust in you, no matter what the storm, it will be well. Be with us, bless us and guide us and keep us, I pray. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Amen. The words of our mouths and meditation of our hearts.